Hi, I'm Sharon Sutherland. I'm here with Wendy Lakusta and with our guest, Richard Singer, for another episode of Mediation Works, talking about strata disputes. We've invited Richard here today to talk a little bit about the kinds of processes mediators can use to make a conversation that might seem like it could be high conflict or very difficult because of the subject matter, because of the personalities involved, because of just how many people are in the room. How a mediator can make that a more comfortable and productive process. So, Richard, we're just going to kind of turn to you and say, welcome. And did you have anywhere you wanted to kind of start with the topic about how does a mediator make a process comfortable?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm passionate about mediation, so I always enjoy talking about it. Maybe we'll just pick it up from, at the point at which you get a referral, because it's important, obviously, to start getting a feel for who needs to be at the table and what some of the issues are ahead of time in planning out how to orchestrate how the mediation is going to proceed, especially in situations where you think that there's going to be potential conflict and members of the strata are not necessarily getting along, or they have a bit of an acrimonious relationship. So part of it is structuring, okay, who needs to be at the table? The number of participants at the table, whether it's just the parties themselves, or whether it's the strata and the named parties, or if there's a bunch of other relevant participants that need to be at the table. So that's one aspect of it, is trying to filter out, having the right parties there. And also, maybe speaking to them ahead of time in setting it up and laying out some of the... giving them a bit of an overview of what the process is and how it's going to proceed, alleviate any of the potential concerns or anxieties that they have. And I'm sure what would happen is they'd start talking about the conflict, and they'd start talking about, maybe not being able to be in the same room with the person, or really not really liking the person very much, and some of the difficulties and challenges that they have, which is a bit of a heads up. And part of that, our role as mediators, is to assure them that it's going to be a very structured process, and that we're going to be going out of our way to manage both the process in a way that people feel comfortable and safe being at the table, and also that there's a safe, productive, sort of emotional climate, and really when we're talking about mediation and actually engaging in a mediation discussion, those are the two things that we can do as mediators to make sure that people are feeling safe and comfortable, and that the mediation can progress. Because I think that that's what people fear, is that, oh my God, as soon as I sit down and start talking, we're going to get into a big fight, or it's going to get really emotional, and and we want to be able to proceed. But it's our job as mediators to make sure that there's a structure around the process, and that each side would have an opportunity to speak uninterrupted, and to share their views, and further on to be able to respond to some of the issues, and to show bring out whatever documentation and evidence that they might have to support their side of things, and be able to structure it in a way that we can have a sort of a back and forth discussion. And if that means laying out some ground rules, and of course enforcing those ground rules as may be necessary, and of course being able to jump in and intervene at such time when frustrations start to escalate, and people start to start laying blame, start accusing each other. Our job is to jump in a sort of productive way to redirect the conversation, and to keep it at all times like civil and respectful and productive. I've said a whole lot there, so maybe I'll pause. And I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and maybe I will kind of just jump in and kind of highlight a couple things that actually sound like really interesting bits there. One of the words I heard you use actually quite early in that was orchestrate, which I think is actually, and you were talking about structuring, and I think those two words together are actually kind of, might give a lot of relief to people who are thinking about, well, what will it be like? The mediator will actually be orchestrating and structuring, coming up with a plan. And it sounds like in your situation, you would normally do that ahead of time, talking to parties and getting some idea of what their needs are, and coming up with some kind of plan with them that addresses some of those kinds of issues.
The whole preparation aspect of it. That's what it was coming up for me as well.
That's very important. It's very important in a mediation, because I'm sure people have anxieties and apprehensions, and they, and they'll probably voice those when the mediator contacts them to introduce themselves and arrange mediation and potentially talk to them a little bit ahead of time to find out what some of the issues are.
Sure.
So those concerns will come out, and then the mediator can and address those and make sure that if people are feeling uncomfortable about having certain participants at the table, well, we can try to get to the bottom of that. We can try to alleviate any concerns, or we'll just make sure that there's an agreement around the table as sort of who participates. And of course, another important part of it is to really clearly lay out for them what the process is, so they're not walking in blindly and they're feeling confident, in what's going to happen when they're in the room. And of course, then it's our job as mediators to make sure we execute that in a way that's sort of congruent with that.
Right, because a lot of their anxieties are based on their past interactions and their past, what's happened in the dispute. And so they're not understanding that having a neutral third party involved can change what it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No doubt, because one thing we find is that it doesn't take much to trigger people emotionally in high conflict situations.
Yeah, sure.
And these people are, talking about, living in stratas, they're neighbors with each other, they probably are not getting along so well at this point. There might be a lot of bad feelings. There may have been, arguments where there's raised voices and there's angry tones, and it's our job to ensure that doesn't happen, and that the emotions don't escalate to the point where people, don't feel comfortable being in the room, and they don't feel comfortable participating in mediation anymore. So we have to assure them that that's not going to happen, and then we have to, of course, see that through to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, it's kind of interesting as you talk about that. One of the things that I keep hearing people say is, well, it wouldn't be a good one for mediation because we had this bad interaction before.
Yeah.
And so, and often it's framed as the other guy's a jerk, and so therefore, there's no way we can sit down and have a discussion. But in fact, a lot of what you're talking about are tools to actually allow that conversation to take place, which might, I don't know, it might be really nice to know that when people get into a room and there is another person there, it really changes the dynamic.
Absolutely. It's not a free-for-all.
Yeah.
There's a reason why people are asking for assistance from a third party, because they're unable to talk to each other. So the mediator can, in a very sort of nonchalant way, control the whole discussion. By asking questions, by summarizing, by paraphrasing, by turning to people and asking them to respond back to the other party, by jumping in when it looks like the parties are starting to go off track, or of course if they start to get frustrated, the mediator can control the whole dialogue.
And having an agenda and keeping the people on track with the agenda, so that they're not going off into their other side kinds of.
Yes, and being very transparent about that as well. That there is an agenda. This is how we're going to proceed.
Exactly.
And we're going to follow some kind of path that makes sense to people in terms of identifying, what the issues are, and making sure that we focus in on, each and every issue, separately, and we don't just meander around without any direction whatsoever. So there's a whole aspect of managing the process, right? And there is a process to it. At the same time, of course, having flexibility, giving parties an opportunity to actually talk, a little bit of latitude to say what they have to say, but it's not a free-for-all, and it's not just a sort of big brouhaha. It's just and we'll manage that every step of the way.
Which is what they were used to, the big brouhaha.
Well, exactly. And it's really, I think it's often a relief to realize that there's a way to do this that isn't either the big brouhaha, or alternatively, having some decision maker where you each talk and you have to say all the worst things you possibly can about each other.
Yeah.
This is something completely different. It's let's work together and try and come up with some kind of productive conversation as to how we can solve it.
Yeah, sort of. Okay, so in the litigation process, obviously the purpose is to make the other side look bad, and if that means that you have to I don't know, almost be abusive towards the other person, or confront them adversarially, that's what happens. But in this process, what we're trying to do is focus on the issues, Stay away from personality conflicts.
Yeah.
Stay away from arguing. Finding out what's important to people, really important to people in the situation as a whole, and then specific issues related to the situation as a whole. Just trying to zero in all the time on what's important to people and getting people to share information on that basis, not just fighting and arguing with each other to see who's stronger, who's more powerful, or who's tougher.
Yeah. Now, Richard, I know we're really close to kind of our time here. But I know you brought up earlier when you were talking with Wendy and me about the possibility of having the right people in the room, who has authority to settle, those kinds of things. Do you want to just talk really quickly about who ought to be in one of these meetings? Because that might be something people are concerned about.
Sure. And when the mediator becomes engaged in the process and takes on the mediation, obviously there's going to be, you find out who the main parties to the mediation are, and there might be the simplest format might be having a member or members of the strata dealing with one or more strata members. So maybe multi-party in that respects. You may have to invite additional people. But one of the things that's really important that I did want to emphasize, of course, is having the right people, the decision makers at the table. Whether it's the owners themselves of the strata unit, but more importantly for the strata council representing the strata as a whole, that it's either that you have the key members of the strata council who do have authority to settle, right, with authorization from the membership at large as well. Because quite often what we see is that either you don't have the right strata people at the council, at the mediation, so they can't make a decision, or even if you have the right people at the table, they have not canvassed with membership the other strata members, so they may only have a settlement offer to make within a certain within a certain scope, and it may not be enough when you're in the moment and you're trying to come to a resolution and you're looking at various types of proposals that are going back and forth, and it's really frustrating for people when you don't have when there isn't authority to settle. So that having the right people at the table, having authority to settle, really crucial.
Well, thank you so much for coming today, Richard, and thank you so much for talking about this. I know there's so much more you could say about
we'll go on all day.
but thank you.
Okay, and thank you for inviting me.